Deputy Michael McNamara has 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. I suppose I've listening to the budget speeches on Tuesday and reflecting on it since, it seems that this budget is really a little bit of everything and very little of anything. I think, it lacks any particular strategic direction. It's pretty much, continue with the way we are, give a little bit to everybody and let's not change the status quo because, there could be an election soon, is what I've taken from this budget. Maybe I'm wrong, we'll see. I want to return, though, to a couple of initiatives that are in the budget. In doing so, I'm very minded by a conversation I had last night with a constituent with a lot of experience in management in our health service. And our conversation concluded, and he said, throwing money at dysfunction doesn't really stop the dysfunction. It just it wastes the money. Unless you actually address systemic problems, throwing money at it isn't really going to matter. And there's two things I want to focus on. That's the money for aviation. I welcome it to the extent that obviously our aviation sector is in a very difficult place. Obviously something needs to be done. But unless we address the root causes of the problems in our aviation sector, throwing a little bit of money at it isn't going to help. Now, I do welcome the additional money for regional airports, and I particularly welcome the fact that Shannon and Cork is going to be able to draw money from that fund into the future. But we don't have an aviation policy in this state. There's a lot of talk, particularly from Sinn Féin, about the necessity to bring Shannon Airport back under the ownership of the Dublin Airport Authority, so that there's one airport authority. And that may well be, although I'm not particularly convinced by it. But unless and until we have an aviation policy in the state, it doesn't really matter, because Dublin Airport was competing with Shannon Airport when they were in the same group, and Dublin Airport is competing with Shannon Airport when they're in different groups. So the actual ownership structure is very secondary to the fact that Dublin Airport is doing everything possible to take out Shannon Airport. And to compensate for that, the government that owns Dublin Airport, or the state that owns Dublin Airport, is going to give Shannon Airport a little bit more money, while it continues to be undercut by Dublin Airport in any of the deals it tries to make. A large part, the 90 million funding is I heard Eamon Ryan say on the radio, is going to go towards landing fees. Now, that is something that's transferred on to passengers. I think is it maybe 14 to 20 euros a passenger that works out at. It's a sizable sum of money that people look at when they're determining where they're going to fly to, because it's going to add to the cost of your ticket. But of course, people who don't have a vaccine passport, and that's a larger proportion of the population in any other European country than it is here. These are the people that we're trying to attract to come into the country. Now, we require them to have a PCR test in order to return, to come into Ireland. And just like Irish people who go abroad, they have to have a PCR test to come back. Now, that's unique in Europe. Other countries work with an antigen test and have done since it was reopened. So this PCR test costs about 100 euros, 120, 150 euros, depending where you are. Of course, you have to go to a particular institution to get a PCR test in those other countries, and that means you have to go, because it's only used to confirm a clinical diagnosis in most countries. So you have to go and queue up with people who have COVID, who've been clinically diagnosed having COVID. So you go up and you queue with them to get this PCR test that costs 120 euros, thereby, it's a contagious disease, we're told. So it greatly increases your chances of getting it. You get the test, it's negative because you just got COVID, and you come back and you produce this PCR test and it costs you 120 euros. And that's not a disincentive to coming to Ireland, but the 20 euros landing charge is. It's utter nonsense. Derelict sites. According to local authorities in Ireland, there are only 1,000 derelict sites in the whole country. Now, that's nonsense. There's 1,000 derelict sites in Clare alone. I'm sure there's 1,000 derelict sites in Carlow. I'm sure there's 1,000 derelict sites in Louth, although there was a local authority staff member in Louth who was very active dealing with derelict sites, and in response to his activity, he got moved sideways out of his job. But anyway, the local authorities are doing nothing to combat derelict sites, just as local authorities were doing very little to combat vacant sites. So now there's a new tax on zoned land. And the land on which that tax is going to be levied is going to be identified by the local authorities who did nothing to use the infrastructure that they had at their disposal, or the measures that they had at their disposal to combat vacant sites, who are doing almost nothing to combat derelict sites, and yet the government is doing nothing at all in this budget about derelict sites. Now, I called for two measures. One is a reduction in capital gains tax on those selling derelict sites for a short period of time, a window in which to sell them, use them or lose them. And also perhaps that it be the Help to Buy scheme be extended to include people buying a derelict site and bringing it back into occupation. There should be tight conditionality on it, there should be a window on it, but these are measures which, because no matter what incentives the government brings in around housing, it's going to be 5 to 10 years before we see results. But you can bring derelict sites back because you don't have to go through the planning process in many instances. You can bring them back into use very quickly, and yet the government has done nothing about that. So that is something that I'm disappointed that wasn't in this budget. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Deputy.